Welcome to the Unit 3 of Development Economics. Our unit today is titled The Characteristics of Developing Countries. To introduce you to the session, we have Professor Upala Vidhanapathirana, of the Department of Social Sciences, Open University of Sri Lanka. To begin this session, Professor Vidhanapathirana, could you tell us why do we study the characteristics of developing countries?
Thank you, Lal. Now, if you look at the world today, you have the developed countries and developing countries going hand in hand. You can see a continuum where you have very rich countries on the one hand and the other extreme of very poor countries. So you have this continuity. And this continuity gives rise to a very huge diversity among countries and also between countries. So if one studies if one can study, choose a country and study the characteristics of that country, you and I will be able to say where that country stands in terms of development. Maybe that country is good in terms of the rate of development or status of development, or not very good in the status of development. And that is why in development economics, we study the characteristics of developing countries to identify where different countries stand in the continuum of development.
Okay. Professor Vidhanapathirana, what is the impact of low income and slow growth rate?
Yeah. Now, when we look at the characteristics, Lal, in fact, people have listed about sometimes 6 characteristics major, and some others have a long list of characteristics of sometimes 14 to 15 characteristics of development. So of those long list of characteristics, the first one happens to be the low income and the slow growth rate. So low income is important because most of the developing countries have a lower GDP base. If you look at the total GDP or if you look at the per capita GDP, their base is low. To give you just an example, for instance, a country like say Rwanda may have a GDP base of around $500. Whereas if you look at a country like Qatar, its per capita GDP is more than $100,000. So that will tell us in terms of GDP where the countries in the world, roughly about 190 countries in the world, stand in terms of GDP base. Now, second point is, why is this gap? The gap is important because the gap is risen as a result of the rate of growth of economics, rate of growth of GDP. So this rate of growth of GDP could give rise to a concept called development gap. A country which has a lower base plus a slow rate of growth will be having a very slow improvement, very slow progress. In comparison with another country with a very high base plus a high rate of growth. So when a country with a high rate of growth plus a high base compares with a country with a low base and low rate of growth, gives rise to what we call the development gap. So it is therefore important for us to know the rate of development. One other important thing. Now, people have been talking about doubling the GDP. In Sri Lanka, we have been saying that we double it from $1,000 to 2,000 and 2,000 to 4,000. And in the next 5 years, from 4,000 to 7,500. Now, what is this doubling and how does it occur? Arithmetically or mathematically, the doubling is a ratio which is known as rule of 72, which means a country growing at 1% requires 72 years to complete the doubling. If you extend the argument, a country that has a growth rate of 2% will take 36 years. A country that has 8% which might take 9 years or more, right? So therefore, doubling depends on the rate of growth. If a country has a high rate of growth, it can double within a shorter period of time. If a country has a low rate of growth, it takes a longer time to double the income, GDP income.
So, Professor, why is human capital important for development?
Yeah, I think in the list that most people have in their mind, one of the important condition or criteria or characteristics is human capital. Why human capital is development? Because it is not the physical capital that helps increase the rate of growth of GDP or the progress of a country. There can be many countries with lots and lots of endowments like, diamonds, like fuel, like gases, like petrol, and even gold. But they are not developed. For example, you take Nigeria, is not a developed country with all the endowments. On the other hand, you have countries like Japan, without much of an endowment, the country has grown and developed much faster. So this difference arises from the human capital. In fact, people say it has two layers, the primary and advanced layer. The primary layer of human capital is about, having some education, some literacy, and some good health, which make people to work hard, which make people to work fast, which make people to work better. But if you have advanced layer, which has other ingredients of human capital, they will do better jobs, creative jobs, productive jobs that will make the development faster. So it is this division, these characteristics of human capital that helps people to have a faster development. In fact, if you look at organizations, you need knowledgeable people, you have to train them, you have to empower them, you have to reward them for that company to work better. Likewise, a country to work better, you have to knowledgeable human capital, you have to have them trained continuously, you have to recognize them, empower them, you have to reward them for those people who do better. So if you can do that, those countries do work faster, better than the other countries that do slower and in a not very progressive manner.
Which brings us to the next question. Why only some countries are developed and the others are not?
Yeah. In fact, first if you look at the development gap, which is, some countries are developed and others are not, means that there's a development gap. There's this development gap internationally and also development gap nationally. If you look at, say, people who live in Colombo, whatever criteria you use, you might see that they are more developed than some of those people who live in further away areas like Badulla. Likewise, some countries in the world are more developed. For instance, if you look at the poorest set of countries, something like 30 to 40 countries, their share of income, world income, is 1.5% of the world income. Whereas, if you look at that is 56% of the population, 56% of the population in the world. This 56% population of the world, their total income share is, in other calculation says, is 16%. Meaning that the rich few percent of people, like maybe about the, say, 5%, rich 5, receives much higher share of GDP. So that shows the rich-poor gap nationally, rich-poor gap internationally. Now, this rich-poor gap, very unfortunately, over the years from 1930 to 2006, you'll see later the graphs, have shown that the developed countries have grown faster, which are better base, and medium countries, middle-level countries have grown little slower, but even sufficiently fast. But then the poorer countries have not grown at all in some cases. So that has given rise to a relatively very serious, very severe gap between the rich and poor countries. And as a result, you will see most developed countries are located in the US, United States, that part of the world, the first world, and then also the EU countries. And to the east, you have Japan and South Korea. And also east, the South Pole, you have Australia and New Zealand. Those are the places where you have the rich people. But most the poorest people live in Africa, which is the sub-Saharan part of Africa. And also some parts of Asia, like in Asia, I think, particularly South Asia, the Afghanistan, and also countries like Nepal, Bhutan, and even Burma are places where I have the very poor people,
Okay, but is it true that a large number of people in developing countries are poor?
Yes, I think this argument gets to that point if you look at the poverty, which is the poverty levels of people in the countries, and if you also look at the absolute poverty in the poor in those countries, most of the poor people live in those countries. As a ratio, the poverty incidence in sub-Saharan Africa, this must be in 2006 again, is more than 40%. That is, almost every second person that you find in the street, if you line them up, is a poor person, right? And if you come to South Asia, it's about 30%, which is every third person is a poor person. Now look at it in the Middle East and North Africa, it's 1.5%. East Asia, it's about 10%. So that is the incidence of poverty in those countries. And there are also, we look at the income, but there are related to income, you have other problems like health problems, more health deprivation in these poor countries like diseases, infectious diseases, malaria and diarrhea, and Ebola, very recent incident. Then because of that, they have a very short life expectancy, like 50 years of life expectancy. In comparison with a country like Japan, it's about 77 years of life expectancy. The concept of life expectancy also means that a child born today will live either 50 years or 60 years or 70 years or almost 80 years. So if a child born in Japan lives about 77 years, a child born in a country like Congo lives about 40 years. So that's almost like double the time. Another problem is these small people have two other related problems of stunting. Stunting is, they are not having the correct height for the age, so they are relatively shorter people. And also they have another problem called wasting. Wasting is, the people are malnourished. They don't have, you can see some of the pictures of people who live in African countries. You have the skin and the bone. You can see all the bones covered by the skin. So that is the problem of wasting. So these are some of the other aspects of development gap that we see between countries.
Right. So what about population growth? Is it a real development issue?
Yeah. People say that very unfortunately, about 5/6 of the world's population live in the developing world. I mean, if you take, which is not fair for us to do it right now. For instance, even China is not a developed country even today. although it's the second richest country in the world. India is the second most populous country in the world, and Indonesia is another populous country in the world. So these are countries where you have a large number of poor people, and these poor people has another problem of a high growth rate of population, like 2% growth rate. Not China, but sub-Saharan African countries have a rate of growth of population which is about 5%. If you compare that with a rich country, which is 0% or 0.5% or 0.2%, right? So therefore, there's another problem, and related to that is because of the high rate of growth, a lot of these people are dependent on young people who depend on the people who earn. So these are some of the population problems that make population growth an important characteristics of underdevelopment.
Right. Which brings me to the last question. You know, the countries that created underdevelopment, there's a tendency for them to blame less developed countries for being underdeveloped. Could you please discuss this statement?
Yeah. Now, there are a few components that go into the one. One is these poor countries have been colonies. They have what we call the colonial impact. About 80 less developed countries have been subjected to European colonial influence. And colonial countries have, from the history and even today, want us to do the extractive ventures like cutting trees, getting the whatever that you can get from the earth, and then sell them to it without developing them, without improving them, without raising the value addition. So that causes a development problem. Also, you have the elitism within developing countries, which are created by the colonial impact. And another one is the slavery. You also have other problems of social fractionalization. That is, within the developing countries, people are fighting each other for sharing resources. You have the ethnic, linguistic, religious divisions known as fractionalization, which have been the creation of the developed world, very unfortunately. So there are conflicts, and all these conflicts causes underdevelopment. Then also you have large rural population, again partly because of the colonial impact, and these rural population also are blamed for not very productive in their activities in comparison with the modern sector, urban sector. So also we have, most of the poor countries have a thing called adverse geography, where some of them are landlocked, some of them they don't have natural resources, some of them are more succumb to global warming. Like, most of the countries that are located in the tropical areas are more subjected to, or severely subjected to, the global warming. So these are some of the things that are very unfortunately, they have been made poor by the rich, and now they are blaming them for their poverty.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Vidana Patrana. That is the session 3 of Development Economics, the characteristics of developing countries. We suggest that you read the relevant unit in your textbook so that you can elaborate upon and consolidate this knowledge. Thank you.